June 1977, a lonely stretch of desert road outside Tucson, Arizona. A man's body lies sprawled on the sand, a bullet wound in the back of his head. He's wearing a bulletproof vest under his shirt, protection that failed to save him. Nearby sits his own .357 Magnum revolver, oddly wiped clean of fingerprints. In his mouth, some accounts claim, was a coin, a sinister calling card, though official reports note that the fatal bullet had lodged between his teeth, and hidden in his clothing is perhaps the strangest clue of all: a $2 bill covered in cryptic writing. Authorities would quickly rule this death a suicide, but many who knew the victim insist he was murdered. This is the story of Charles Morgan. Chuck Morgan was a successful 39-year-old escrow company owner from Tucson, Arizona. He lived with his wife, Ruth, and their 4 young daughters, and he had built up his business, statewide escrow service, over 15 years. By all appearances, Morgan was a hard-working family man living an ordinary life, but behind the scenes, he was entangled in something much darker. In the 1970s, Arizona had become a haven for organized crime. Mafia families from New York and elsewhere, including the notorious Bonanno family, flocked to Tucson. A loophole in state law allowed anyone to buy land through blind trusts, perfect for laundering money without leaving a paper trail. Chuck Morgan, as an escrow agent, stood at the crossroads of these secretive land deals. Some reports later revealed that Morgan handled real estate escrow work for known crime families, facilitating gold and platinum transactions that existed only on paper. He even testified in a secret state investigation into illegal dealings at a local bank shortly before his death. Chuck had hinted to his wife that there was money laundering going on in Tucson, but he claimed he wasn't personally involved and told her, "The less you and the girls know, the better." In hindsight, it seems Chuck Morgan knew far more than he admitted, knowledge that may have signed his death warrant. On the morning of March 22, 1977, Chuck Morgan left home to drive his daughters to school and head into the office. It was a day like any other, until Chuck vanished. He didn't return that night or the next. Ruth Morgan was frantic. 3 days later, in the dead of night, Chuck came stumbling back to their house at 2 a.m. He was disheveled, missing one shoe, and handcuffs dangled from one of his ankles and his wrists. Ruth ran to him, but Chuck couldn't speak. He frantically motioned to his throat. Concerned and confused, Ruth fetched a pen and notepad. Ruth Morgan's eyes widened as her husband scrawled out a shocking explanation. Chuck wrote that he had been kidnapped and tortured. His captors, he claimed, had painted his throat with a potent hallucinogenic drug. If he spoke or cried out, the poison would seep in and either drive him insane or kill him. Ruth wanted to call the police or get him to a hospital, but Chuck furiously shook his head. In tense, scribbled handwriting, he warned her that if authorities were brought in, that would be signing a death warrant for the entire family. Whatever trouble Chuck was in, it was deadly serious. Over the next week, Ruth nursed Chuck in secrecy, feeding him with an eyedropper until his voice returned. During this time, Chuck hinted at a secret double life. He confided to Ruth that he'd been working clandestinely as an agent of the United States. At one point, he wrote, "They took my Treasury identification," revealing that he claimed to be affiliated with the U.S. Treasury Department. This was the first time Ruth had heard any such thing. Chuck implied he'd been helping the government for 2 or 3 years, operating under a hidden identity. It sounded like something out of a spy novel, but Chuck's terror was real. He later told his father that if anything ever happened to him, there was a letter explaining everything, a letter that has never been found. After this nightmare, Chuck Morgan was a changed man. He became extremely cautious and paranoid, with good reason. Convinced they may come for him again, Chuck grew a beard and began wearing a bulletproof vest at all times. He refused to let anyone drive his children to school. Only he and he alone would transport his daughters. He warned the school to never release the girls to anyone but him. At home, Chuck kept weapons and a CB radio close by. Friends noticed he looked over his shoulder often. The Morgans were now living under a shadow of fear. Despite the dangers, Chuck continued working and going about business as best he could. He rarely spoke of what happened, telling Ruth only that the people who were after him knew everyone and could reach even into the justice system if they wanted. 2 months passed with no developments. Then, on June 7, 1977, Chuck Morgan vanished again, this time for good. That morning in June began normally. Chuck headed to work after taking the kids to school. He mentioned plans to attend a Masonic meeting that evening, but sometime that afternoon, Chuck disappeared. A call from a downtown payphone to his office in the afternoon was the last anyone heard from him. He said he'd be arriving in 30 minutes, but never showed up. When Chuck didn't come home, Ruth remembered his previous warning and feared the worst. Days turned into a week with no sign of him. Then, 9 days after he vanished, Ruth received a chilling phone call. On the other end of the line was a female voice, unfamiliar and urgent. "Ruthie?" the woman asked. "Chuck is all right. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 1 through 8, and then abruptly hung up. Ruth was left holding the phone, heart pounding. Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8 is a passage about mortality, describing how men are afraid of dangers in the street and how the dust returns to the earth as it was. In other words, it speaks of death. The mysterious caller had essentially told Ruth in code that Chuck's time might be up. 2 days later, on June 18, 1977, the search for Chuck Morgan came to an end. His body was discovered about 40 miles west of Tucson, near an isolated area known as the San Juan Springs. He was lying 30 feet off the highway, face down in the desert dirt next to his parked car. Chuck was still wearing his bulletproof vest, but it hadn't saved him. A single large caliber bullet had been fired into the back of his head at close range. Investigators determined it was from Chuck's own .357 Magnum revolver, which was found on the ground near his right hand. Yet the scene raised far more questions than it answered. There were no fingerprints at all on the gun, not even Chuck's. And while there was gunshot residue on Chuck's left hand, suggesting he'd fired a weapon recently, the idea that he shot himself seemed improbable. For one, the entry wound was at the back of his head, an awkward angle for a self-inflicted wound. For another, who puts on a Kevlar vest to kill themselves? As journalist Don Devereaux would later dryly note, "I've never seen a fellow take himself out to the desert wearing a bulletproof vest and shoot himself in the back of the head." Chuck's car yielded a trove of bizarre evidence. Investigators found a note in Chuck's handwriting with directions, essentially a hand-drawn map to the very spot where his body lay. It was as if he'd been lured or instructed to drive out there. Inside the vehicle were several weapons and boxes of ammunition, as well as a CB radio, an arsenal suggesting Chuck came prepared for trouble. There was also a pair of sunglasses in the car that did not belong to Chuck or anyone in his family. Stranger still, police discovered one of Chuck's own molars, wrapped carefully in a white handkerchief on the back seat. It appeared to have been removed by force. The eerie implications of these clues painted a scene that was anything but an ordinary suicide. Tucked inside Chuck Morgan's underwear was a $2 bill clipped to his briefs. On it, someone had scrawled several lines of handwritten code. 7 Spanish names. The notation Ecclesiastes 12, the very same Bible chapter and verses 1 through 8 that the anonymous caller Green Eyes had given to Ruthie 2 days earlier. The serial number of the $2 bill had arrows drawn to certain digits, perhaps highlighting the Bible verses in some way. On the back of the bill, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were numbered 1 through 7, corresponding to those letters A through G, and there was a crude map sketched on the bill, showing roads leading to the border between Tucson, Arizona and Mexico. 2 towns were marked, Robles Junction and Sasabe, both known hotspots for smuggling activity in the 1970s. It was as if Chuck Morgan, or someone connected to him, had left a post-mortem puzzle, a code that screamed of espionage, organized crime, or both. Investigators were baffled by these clues. Was Chuck trying to send a message? If so, deciphering it would prove difficult. In the late 1970s, without today's digital cryptography tools, the meaning behind the $2 bill remained elusive, and to this day the coded $2 bill has never been definitively explained. While police puzzled over the evidence, a new character entered the story, the mysterious caller who identified herself as Green Eyes. 2 days after Chuck's body was found, an anonymous woman called the Pima County Sheriff's Department. She told authorities that she had been with Chuck in the days before his death. According to this woman, Green Eyes, Chuck had met her at a local motel after he disappeared, and he was carrying a black briefcase stuffed with cash. Chuck told her that there was a $90,000 contract out on his life, placed by a mob organization, and that he had raised about $80,000 in cash to buy off the hitman. If they accept this, he told her, then everything will be all right. Green Eyes claimed she last heard from Chuck a day or two before his body was found, when he called her to say one final time that everything's okay. But everything was not okay. If Chuck truly tried to ransom his own life, the plan failed. Investigators did verify part of Green Eyes' story. They found CCTV footage of Chuck at a motel meeting with a woman fitting her description, and they even recovered the very briefcase she described from Chuck's car. However, the briefcase was now empty. The tens of thousands of dollars Chuck allegedly had were gone. It seems likely that whoever killed Chuck took the payoff money and left behind only paperwork. In the aftermath of Chuck Morgan's death, events took an even more ominous turn. At the morgue, the medical examiner noted that Chuck's death was officially inconclusive. He couldn't determine with certainty whether it was self-inflicted or homicide. Nevertheless, some detectives leaned toward labeling it as a suicide, pointing out the gunshot residue on Chuck's hand as if he had fired the gun himself. Within 2 months, by August 1977, the Pima County Sheriff's Office formally closed the case, declaring Chuck's death a suicide. "We have found no evidence that anyone took part in the death but himself," one official announced. To many, this conclusion was astounding given the circumstances. Chuck's family disagreed with the suicide ruling. Ruth Morgan was adamant that Chuck had no reason to kill himself and would never abandon his wife and daughters that way. "There is no way Chuck would have committed suicide," she said. "If he had even contemplated it, he would have left a letter for his girls and for me." Her words rang true. Chuck had promised a letter explaining everything if something happened, but none were to be found. To Ruth, the lack of a note wasn't just heartbreaking, it was telling. She believed someone had silenced Chuck to keep his secrets hidden. "I'd like to know why," she said. "I don't think we'll ever find out who killed him." Meanwhile, strange burglaries targeted Chuck's property. His car, which had been impounded by police, was reportedly broken into while in law enforcement custody. Around the same time, Chuck's office was raided by persons unknown. Then, about 3 weeks after his death, Ruth Morgan received yet another knock on the door. This time it was 2 men in suits who flashed badges and introduced themselves as FBI agents. They entered the Morgan home without elaborating on their purpose and proceeded to ransack the house, turning over drawers and searching for hours. Ruth watched in disbelief. She was so upset by their aggressive search that she failed to get their names, and they left as abruptly as they arrived, carrying nothing. To this day, Ruth never learned what, if anything, they were looking for. It's not even confirmed if they were truly from the FBI. When journalist Don Devereaux later inquired with the FBI about Chuck Morgan's case, the Bureau had a puzzling response. They claimed to have no file on Charles Morgan at all, as if he never existed. This, despite multiple credible reports that FBI agents, or imposters, were swarming over his case in 1977. Devereaux filed a Freedom of Information Act request, but came up empty. No records, no investigation, nothing. The official silence from federal authorities raised a disturbing possibility. Had Chuck Morgan been working for the government after all? And had he been erased from the records? Or was the government itself involved in whatever treachery led to his death? The lack of information only fueled speculation. The case of Chuck Morgan grew cold, but it was far from forgotten. Over the years, it has spawned a host of conspiracy theories, each more tantalizing than the last. One theory holds that Chuck was indeed an honest man who got too close to the mafia's secrets, and they killed him for it. As evidence, supporters of this theory point to Chuck's extensive dealings in money laundering and bogus bullion transactions on behalf of crime families. Tips came in suggesting that from 1973 until his death, Chuck had laundered huge sums of money through his escrow business, possibly upwards of $1 billion, and that he kept detailed duplicate records of these illegal deals. If true, those records would be dynamite evidence against powerful people. Devereaux, who investigated these new leads, believes Chuck Morgan was killed because he held the documentation of a criminal enterprise. In this scenario, the bizarre clues, like the $2 bill, could have been Chuck's desperate attempt to leave a trail of breadcrumbs about who was responsible. Perhaps the coded bill was meant for the FBI, a puzzle only they could unlock, if they'd only admit they knew him. Another theory suggests that Chuck Morgan wasn't a good guy at all, but was himself deeply involved in organized crime. Maybe he double-crossed the wrong people. The secrecy, the Treasury ID story, could it have been a cover for criminal dealings? Some speculate Chuck might have been laundering money for mobsters and skimming off the top or threatening to blow the whistle. In that case, the mob could have staged his death to look bizarre, or even like a suicide, as a warning to others. The $2 bill, with its list of names and map to smuggling routes, might have been a red herring or an intimidation tactic. It's worth noting that the very verse referenced, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, 1-8, declares everything is meaningless, almost taunting investigators with the futility of solving the case. A third theory involves espionage and government intrigue. Chuck claimed to be a federal undercover agent. If that's true, perhaps he was operating in a clandestine operation to expose corruption, a secret agent among mobsters. When his cover was blown, he became a liability. Could elements of the government have hung him out to dry, or even been complicit in his death to protect larger investigations? It's a dark thought, but the strange FBI behavior, the house search and file denials, makes one wonder if a higher power swept this case under the rug. If Chuck was working for the Treasury Department or another agency, he was a casualty in a much larger war, and someone, somewhere, knows why he died. Most likely, Chuck Morgan's fate lies at the nexus of these theories, organized crime and government secrets colliding. As one observer noted, he got a little too close to the flame, whether by naively helping the feds or greedily helping the mob. Chuck was in over his head. The common denominator in every scenario is that Chuck knew too much. And in the underworld of mafia dons and maybe double-dealing agents, knowing too much can be fatal. Chuck Morgan's story might have ended in that desert in 1977, but its tendrils stretch far beyond. In February 1990, 13 years later, Chuck's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, beaming the bizarre tale of codes and conspiracies into living rooms across America. The renewed exposure brought fresh leads. Devereaux, the journalist, dug deeper and became convinced of Chuck Morgan's role in a massive money laundering ring. But shining a light on long-buried secrets can be dangerous. Just a few months after the TV broadcast, on May 14, 1990, a 35-year-old man named Doug Johnston was found shot to death in his car outside an office in Phoenix. At first glance, it looked like Doug might have taken his own life, except no gun was found at the scene, and Doug had no gunshot residue on his hands. It appeared to be a professional hit. Why is this relevant? Because Doug Johnston's office was across the street from Don Devereaux's office, and Doug drove an almost identical car to Devereaux. Don Devereaux believes that Doug Johnston was killed in a case of mistaken identity, that he was the real target, likely due to his investigations into the Chuck Morgan case. If true, that means that someone was still willing to kill to keep Chuck's secrets hidden, even in 1990. 1 year later, in August 1991, another mysterious death grabbed headlines, one that would later become infamous among conspiracy theorists, and one we featured on our channel just last week. Danny Casolaro, a 44-year-old investigative journalist from Virginia, was found dead in a hotel bathtub in West Virginia, his wrists slashed 10 to 12 times. The death was ruled a suicide, but many, including Casolaro's family, suspect he was murdered. Why? Because he had been investigating a sprawling conspiracy he called the Octopus. He believed that a shadowy cabal linked multiple scandals, from government software theft to Iran-Contra arms deals, into one interconnected web. In the summer of 1991, Casolaro confided to friends that he was on the verge of a major breakthrough, that he'd cut off the head of the octopus soon. He went to Martinsburg, West Virginia to meet a source, and never came home. Here's where the Morgan case surfaces again. Casolaro had reached out to Don Devereaux shortly before his death. Casolaro had caught wind of Chuck Morgan's story, specifically the gold bullion transactions and money laundering leads that Devereaux was uncovering, and he suspected it might be just one tentacle of the octopus. The two men arranged to share information. Devereaux agreed to mail Casolaro some documents on Chuck's gold deals, which potentially involved not just the mob, but international players and maybe even intelligence agencies. But Casolaro died before he ever received that package. To conspiracy researchers, this timing is chilling. 3 men, Chuck Morgan, Doug Johnston, and Danny Casolaro, all died under suspicious circumstances, and all 3 cases appear to intertwine. Casolaro's death, especially, hinted that Chuck Morgan's tale was more than just a local crime. It might have been a piece of a global puzzle of corruption. Casolaro's notes mentioned a desert treasury and other hints that some desert dealings, possibly Chuck's bullion records, were part of his octopus investigation. At the very least, it's confirmed that Casolaro was actively probing Chuck's case. And consider this, if Danny Casolaro was murdered to stop his investigation, as many believe, given that he had told his brother, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident," then whatever he was about to expose was worth killing for. Was it the same secret that got Chuck Morgan killed 14 years earlier? The overlap is tantalizing and disturbing. In 2024, a Netflix docuseries titled American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders dove into Casolaro's death, bringing renewed attention to these connections. Viewers of that series have been shocked to learn of Chuck Morgan's case as a possible prelude to the Casolaro saga. It raises the stakes of Chuck's death. Perhaps he wasn't just a victim of local mob violence, but a casualty of something much bigger. A secret war involving organized crime, financial fraud, and government agencies. In the Grand Octopus Theory, the mafia, rogue intelligence operatives, and corrupt officials were all part of the same beast. Chuck might have stumbled into the octopus's lair back in 1977, with deadly consequences. The desert winds have long since erased the tire tracks and footprints at Chuck Morgan's death scene. Decades have passed, witnesses have died or faded away. Ruth Morgan, Chuck's devoted wife who fought to find the truth, passed in 2006 without ever getting closure. What remains is the story, a jigsaw puzzle of baffling clues and whispered secrets. Consider what we have: a respectable businessman who hinted at being a secret agent, a kidnapping with hallucinogenic torture, a phone call from a mystery woman quoting scripture, a death scene staged with puzzling props, cryptograms on currency, men masquerading as FBI agents destroying evidence, and a chain of allegedly linked deaths stretching into the 1990s. If it's a coincidence, it's almost too bizarre to believe. If it's a conspiracy, it's almost too vast to prove. To this day, the death of Chuck Morgan remains officially unsolved. The local authorities stick by their 45-year-old conclusion of suicide, but virtually everyone familiar with the case doubts that. Too many questions linger. Why would a man wear a bulletproof vest to shoot himself? Who was Green Eyes, really, and did she tell the whole truth? What was the meaning of the cryptic $2 bill? A secret message to authorities? A mafioso warning? Or the desperate ravings of a man in fear? And who benefited from Chuck Morgan's death? Perhaps the most haunting question is whether justice was subverted by powerful forces, either the mob's reach or a government cover-up, or both, making sure that no one was ever charged. In the end, we're left with an unnerving possibility. Chuck Morgan's story may be a small chapter in a much larger saga of crime and cover-up, one that we're only beginning to glimpse. As we close this case file, the image lingers of a lone man standing against shadowy adversaries, a man who tried to save his family and himself but paid the ultimate price. The desert has kept Charles Morgan's secrets well, but for those who seek the truth, the hope remains that someday a crack in the facade will appear and the full story of Chuck, of the octopus, of whatever dark alliance casts that long shadow will finally be brought to light. Until then, the death of Chuck Morgan lives on as one of the most perplexing and spine-chilling cold cases in American history, a true crime puzzle wrapped in riddles, the answers buried somewhere between Tucson and the grave. The desert whispers its questions, but only silence replies. The mystery lives on.